All right, so moving on to the other couple chapters here, some of them I can combine as you read them through because we're just going to touch a little bit on these topics. I'll talk to you a little bit about the art of revision. Let me make this a little bit bigger here for you. Obviously, with any of the poetry that we're going to be writing for our summer semester, we're going to be revising. And if you've ever been in any other writing classes before, especially mine, you'll know that revision is something that is so really deeply important to me, and such an important process as a writer. No person's draft is perfect the first time around. It's not perfect the second time around, the third time, and no draft goes without a fixing. And so writing, revising and writing is so important and a good habit to get into. Um, Most especially with poetry, you want to keep an open mind to looking at your own work because sometimes you write something in the heat of the moment. You're focusing on submitting an assignment, getting something down on the page, and you get it down, you hand it in, and then you get comments from myself and your peers. You have another sort of critical eye of looking at it. So it's hard, how it says this too. It's hard to look at your poem without objectivity, especially after finishing a draft. You need to become less emotionally attached to your own work. And by no means does a critique mean your work is bad or not good or anything like that. So follow through. He uses some of the poems that he talked about last semester in the last chapter. So, Tracks of the Wandering Mind was the poem that he used right here too. And, going through just the first couple lines, phrases like, I want sometimes not but to weep as standing by the trestle deep. So you can already see down here the first line. Um, the poem just sounds like it's trying too hard. Trestle deep, okay, he's right. It rhymes with weep. So that's probably why they used it. You can also look at something like, I long to follow that railroad train to a realm of dream that's free of pain. I'm only a couple lines in, and as I read this one last semester, it just feels like too much happening too fast here. Forced rhyme, different patterns. Um, you know, I would suggest to the student or to the person writing this, do you want to stick with all these sort of, A B sort of symbols that kind of come after here in your ending? Do you want the immediate rhyme scheme? Can you do it something else? And he has, we talked about the idea of making sure that it seems authentic. Kowit says here, is the person who wrote this going to work with rhyme couplets? So you have the two successive lines that rhyme. So weep deep, train pain, somewhere bare, peaks weeks. So that pattern kind of coming after that, that you can very evidently see. So sometimes something you're working on has to have a very formal structure, but sometimes it does not. And that's where revision comes in, and that's where rewriting comes in. So definitely read and look at these examples here as you're going through these chapters, um, especially, and think about the intentionality behind why he uses each of these. We're going to do these with some other poems of our own and some outside of that this week too. So, reading about like sort of the whole writing and rewriting process here is something that we're going to apply to our work and to many of the works that we're going to be read too. And there's some good exercises that we'll kind of practice. I just wanted to tell you that revision is something we're going to work on this entire semester. So I don't want you to feel like it's going to go abandoned or anything. Um, and these are just some brief outlines. Now, our next chapter focuses on music and metaphor, which I'm thinking a lot of you are going to like. So, uh, our chapter starts off with a sort of poem here called Afterglow. It's by one of my favorite poems, and his name is Raymond Carver. Not only a poet, he writes a lot of nonfiction as well. The dusk of the evening comes on. Earlier, a little rain had fallen. You open a drawer and find inside the man's photograph, knowing he has only 2 years to live. He doesn't know this, of course. That's why he can mug for the camera. How could he know what's taking root in his head at that moment? If one looks to the right through boughs and tree trunks, there can be seen crimson patches of the afterglow. No shadows, no half shadows. It is still and damp. The man goes on mugging. I put the picture back in its place along with the others and give my attention instead to the afterglow along the far ridge, light golden on the roses in the garden. Then I can't help myself. I glance once more at that picture. The wink, the broad smile, the jaunty slant of the cigarette. So, what a great poem to start us off. As Kawit says in this chapter, not only about talking about a poem's meaning or process, but thinking about the music that a poem creates. And I love this because whether a poem is meant to be lyrical or not, very much so, we are reminded that poetry is so very connected to music in many, many senses. And I know a lot of you really like music, as I do too. I connect a lot, and I often associate music lyrics as poetry, which you certainly definitely can. So here, I love the different ways of kind of thinking about that more. So you can see here in the poem above, and Kawit talks about this, one of the main musical devices in English poetry, which we are going to read some, back and forth of some other pieces, is, the internal rhyme. That's a device used to very much good effect in here. When I read that poem, you might have felt like it didn't read necessarily like a poem. And we'll do some other examples of that too, but it has sort of a storytelling, a prose kind of effect to it. And as I said, Raymond Carver is not only just a poet, but he was a fiction writer. And knowing that he can do sort of both kind of senses like that, you can really pick up the internal rhymes that you can appreciate. And I love that very much in here. To go along with that, though, are some other sort of technical terms that you're going to want to keep in mind. Some of these were on some of the little cheat sheets I gave you, but the way that these definitions are laid out are really important because we're going to reference them throughout our whole semester. So it's good to kind of, refer to these. And if you want to keep a little cheat sheet for yourself, so you can, when you're critiquing poems and writing your own, have this. A lot of these terms you've probably heard about before in other writing classes, literature classes, so some of them might not come as a surprise. Assonance, in the first two lines, you find a great deal of repetition. So in the poem above, you see dusk, of, and comes, same vowel sound. Line 2, you have the repetition of fallen, drawer, that aw sound that comes into there. Find and inside, the long I sound. All these different examples that you can see laid forth, this is that sort of partial rhyme when you use identical vowel sounds, and that is assonance, and that's one of the, sort of most important devices that you'll see. It's probably one of your SAT words if you remember that. Of course, repetition, and I don't only mean repetition of words, I mean repetition of sounds that you can see in a poem and you can hear in a poem, most especially. So all those O sounds that you can have in this one above. And the technical name for the repetition of words and phrases in the poem is repetend. But if you just refer and look at it as the repetition, I think you'll be fine. Alliteration, one of the big sort of areas that we look at in literature as well. And that's when you're repeating consonant sounds. So I put the picture back in its place. Of course, the words that begin with P and then the one with the B, but sort of has a very similar sounding. It's, the man goes on mugging is a phrase kind of like that. You can see in the example that he gives here from Greenhill's Power. Hardly daring to breathe, I waited belly down with my brother in a dry ditch. So you have all those D, G, and W words as well. And really, this is why you really need to read a lot of these pieces out loud, because sometimes you can just look at these on the page and they just look like words, but reading them out loud helps you feel those similarities in sounds. Some of the other technical terms we're going to look at is rich consonants. So this is Another technique of internal rhyme, a little bit more rare, but still good to know because we're going to talk about it more. Um, if you look at the poem, you refer back to it, how it talks about the word root in line 6 and right at the end of line 7. So they both have the same consonant but different vowel sounds. So that's what rich or full consonants means. But more commonly, you'll see partial consonants. And that's when, you just can call it consonants or, terminal alliteration, whatever you want to call it. It just really looks at and gives us an example of the identity of the final consonant sound in two or more words. So for that first line, fallen and open have the same E end on there, which is good to see. Golden, garden. So that's a little bit easier to kind of pinpoint. And we are going to read some Emily Dickinson, so the example that he gives here is usually easy to see when you're thinking about that. So make sure you read over and denote some of these terminologies. Anaphora is another device that you'll be using. I use it also in other forms of literature. This shows the repetition of an opening word or phrase in certain lines. So when we read Whitman, you can see the example from Song of Myself here, where the hummingbird shimmers, where the laughing gull scoots, where beehives range, where bandneck partridges. You get the idea as the repetition goes through in the poem. So that's a little bit sometimes easier to pinpoint some of that musical denotions to it. And of course, diction and sentence grease. These are different techniques. They're not really, how should I say, they're not the only means by a poet produces musical lines. So sometimes there's harsh sounds, sometimes there's softer sounds too. But when you're going through, every phrase has its own, as Carwit says, tone and pace. And that's the words that are in there and their sounds combined. So you can see the example that he gives here. If Carver had changed and opened his poem this way, as the somberness of evening takes place, and after it had been raining for a while, but now the rain had stopped. It's way more awkward and it doesn't really have that beautiful flow and that prose effect kind of to it. The writing sort of gets choppy and it doesn't really give the reader anything to sort of take away from that. So diction makes a big impression like that when you're going through. That's why, as I said before, word choice is really important. Maybe when you're going through, having that, I especially say having a good thesaurus is really important. So you can, make sure the words you're using are the ones that you're intending to use. I love when Kawit says here, a good rule of thumb is never to use a word that you're proud of. If you don't know the connotations, if you don't know the definitions or how to use the word, then don't put it in there. That's okay. Use something that you're way more familiar with. We'd much more rather that. So we will be going through some of the exercises here, which I think you'll really like because they're good practice to helping you sort of observe and find these parts in what you're kind of looking at on here. So I think that's something that you can really sort of take away from that. And we'll be making some different poetry sort of coming out of that too. So I'll end here before I do the last couple sets of notes. Just, I know you're going to be reading these sections, but I think sometimes it's good, like I said, just to have a little conversation sort of about them.